people. This is a new branch for me, discussing topics related to teaching, especially in Japan, but also this should have relevance in other Asian countries. Please note that these are my ideas and are based more on experience than hard data. Your comments are welcome. Please tell me if you spot anything you think is misleading in any of my videos. Now, I will be speaking just a little slowly, in case any non-native speakers are watching. Well, okay, so that was just one aspect, vocabulary. But what about basic grammar? Let's look at a simple question in the simple present tense, easily within the range of material presented at any Japanese junior high school. Here it is. And now here's a question about the question. And here's another. So let's go through all the elements that I could spot that our students have to deal with. I think it's not so simple as we may imagine. They need to understand first that how many, according to Merriam-Webster, is a two-word interrogative idiom. They have to recognize many and not much, understand a five-word phrase representing the WH on a normal WH question. They need not to be confused by the use of does, even though it comes after a plural noun phrase, brothers and sisters. They need to appreciate the connection between the auxiliary verb does and the verb have. Finally, they need to be aware that your, in your friend, is the possessive form, Y-O-U-R. It takes less than 3 seconds for a native speaker to say this sentence. Our students had to catch all of that, process the meaning, and then they'll have to make their response. I think we need to be aware of how very challenging that can be for someone with very little experience of listening and speaking. How about when they are speaking? First, are they aware that it's normal to use the simple present tense with the verb to have? Are they ready to create a 5-word WH form question? Will they remember to use many and not much? Can they put the subject in the right place between the auxiliary verb and the main verb? And will they remember to add your to friend? We're not finished yet. Will they remember to use the auxiliary verb, or will they say, how many brothers and sisters has your friend? Will they correctly choose the auxiliary verb do, or might they use be? They must not forget the third person singular form. And to make matters worse, they must not use the third person singular form of the main verb. If we think about all that, it's a heck of a lot of things to remember in 3 seconds. Our students may not be as dumb as we might think they are. Moving on, some more nasty questions. How much do we think about our purpose in teaching, and how much do we think about what our students are thinking? While there are in reality all manner of influences on the way our students get taught, in my view, language studies should be focusing on acquisition if they are to have any meaning and if they're ever to be of any use to our students. The next point contrasts teaching for acquisition with teaching for our own convenience, or the convenience of the institutions or exam writers. People in education have good reasons to want to teach their material in convenient packages, such as one particular tense, or items in the kitchen. It's important for teachers to know what they have taught. Likewise, textbook writers need to make clear precisely what contents their books cover. Fair enough. But sticking to the theme of acquisition, let's go into a little detail about some things that give students particular difficulty and can cause teachers problems too. Vocabulary again. Now, we may be constrained by our obligation to teach according to a set syllabus, but if not, surely this question must be vital when choosing vocabulary for our students. I make this comment because more than once I have come across words in materials for Japanese high school students that I have never once encountered in my life. Having to learn useless words is nothing better than a hindrance to students' language development. Lexical sets are really convenient for teaching neatly packaged vocabulary. However, the wisdom of teaching in lexical sets like that has been widely challenged in the literature. Paul Nation, David Noonan, and many others explain that research has shown very poor acquisition of vocabulary in the great majority of students when it's taught in lexical sets. Pity that. It's a really convenient way to teach and to test. Remembering that this started off on the theme of acquisition versus convenience, what do you make of a chart like this? Is there any meaning to this at all? Even if it's handy for us to pop all these forms onto one table, why would this column be included? These are determiners. They aren't even in the same grammatical category as the other items. I frequently find that my students are quite unable to use these correctly in conversation. That's hardly surprising, because we talk in sentences, not in tables. What use is this then? Oh yes, I forgot. Here is an area where we may miss the fact that our students are not getting the point. It's very rare in languages that two or more alternative forms exist with exactly the same meaning. And yet many of my students seem to think that certain grammar forms have pretty much the same meaning. Whether or not they have been taught that, I can't say. Here's one example. Pretty early on in their junior high school studies, students will encounter the will plus base verb form, which they generally consider to mean being about the future. At some point later, they are also taught the be going to plus verb form. Many university students, though, seem to think that these are alternatives with the same meaning or use, which reduces their communicative competence, at least in this area. Now here is one rare example of two forms which do have precisely the same meaning. I have found that the great danger here is if we teach both at the same time, we are very likely to get results like this. Very few teachers would think that these two forms would have the same meaning or the same use. I certainly don't suspect that they are commonly taught that way. And yet the following form is almost the most common form that I encounter in my lower level students year after year, class after class, and even sometimes in intermediate level students. Somehow this pattern has developed in their interlanguage, despite its never having been taught. I suspect that somehow students have understood these as being alternative forms, possibly due to some L1 interference, and then they are tempted to mix them both in written and spoken production. Moving on again. If we want to understand how best to teach, maybe we need to try to understand what goes on in the minds of our students. Well, yes, of course. But if they ever think about language, what do they understand? Well then, how much do we as teachers understand what our students actually understand from the materials we present to them? Following are a few ideas. Here is something that became fashionable a few years ago in some classes in Japan. Of course, once students are in the higher intermediate levels of learning, English dictionaries will help them to think in the target language. But the lower level learners? Well, let's take an example and then see the definition offered. And now let's look at the vocabulary within that definition that they may well be unfamiliar with. And by the way, in Japan, the word handle has this meaning. Simply put, faced with this, the students will not have the first clue of the meaning of the target word. Other examples? If they don't know truck, they certainly won't know vehicle. And if they don't know mouse, they're not going to know rodent. Why not let them find it in their native language? How many idioms and nuanced forms are used by writers of textbooks who seem unaware of the difficulties foreign students might have? Sometimes the writers, or perhaps the editors, simply fail to consider the content they are providing learners. Here is an important and basic grammar form, but it can provide considerable difficulty for some Asian learners. The form needs to be supported with a lot of basic, good, clear examples. And yet in one introductory textbook to writing, within a couple of pages of this form being introduced, the students were confronted with this example, repeated several times. This is a colloquial use of there is, but in this book it's inappropriate and misleading. Any native speaker will know exactly what this question means, but why would any second language learner know? And yet, this appears in one of the more popular low-level textbooks on the market, with no explanation whatever. This is what is really meant. Or maybe even this. Our students need to be able to focus on the points they are studying and learning, but especially at lower levels, the meta-language, the language we need to explain the points or give instructions, can add to their pain. These instructions, common in many books, may look easy enough, but how should the students recognize that these head words are verbs in the imperative when they are usually other grammar forms? Here's another example. And the improved version. This is how we should be writing our directions. Here's another fashionable approach to teaching. But wander around the school cafeteria and see the students staring blankly at all the specialized vocabulary and unfamiliar idioms they are faced with. To what end? Unless they are high intermediate level or better, and armed with a pretty spectacular understanding of the language, they will not benefit from this. Worse, they could lose any hope or confidence they ever had. As teachers, we need to understand just how much they are benefiting, or not, from the materials we use. Of course, this is a question whose answers could fill a book. I'll just take a quick look at one or two issues in the Japanese sphere. There is always the very relevant topic of culture and its effect on language learning, but that also will require one whole video. Another time. Well, this slide is going to look pretty negative, but you might expect that from this question. First, students in Japan are subjected to a very rapid input of new materials, followed by frequent testing. As I understand it, little or no consideration goes into their ability to acquire the language in most classes. And in high school, they are exposed to vocabulary and language forms far beyond those they would ever need in any real-life situation. This I found in a textbook from a popular cram school, teaching a form that is never used in modern communication, besides being dull and useless. Then there exists the awful pressure to teach to the test. And seeing some of the university entrance exams, one wonders what on earth they are meant to accomplish. Whoever established their validity as testing tools? And finally, our poor students are exposed to an array of language misinformation all around them. That last one is from a TV commercial for a chain of English language schools, if you can believe it. A veritable cocktail of barriers for them to face before we even get to see them. Okay, after all those not so positive points and a number of questions left unanswered, in the next video I will try to suggest how, even if we can't do much to change the national level policies, we can make efforts to teach our students in better ways, hopefully to empower them in their communicative abilities. Thanks so much for watching. Look out for links to upcoming vids in this series, and please check the vids for students too, to see if any of them can help your classes. Feel free to like and also to comment. I will try to answer soon enough. And if there is something that really needs fixing, please let me know. See you in the next vid.